Jerusalem. And there are others if I were to think about it, but those are two of the more extreme ones.
Doesn't Michael Licona believe that the Shroud of Turin is Jesus?
Well, Gary Habermas, who is the top scholar in the world on the resurrection, he's written more than anybody else. His magnum opus is over 5,000 pages. He's editing it right now. Gary is also an expert on the Shroud of Turin. And if you ask Gary, do you think the Shroud of Turin is authentic? He would say, I'm 80% sure it is. And he will give you some of the reasons for that. The Shroud of Turin is supposedly the burial cloth of Christ. And you may have heard, they carbon dated that to the Middle Ages. Yeah, what they carbon dated was a piece of it that had been repaired in the Middle Ages due to a fire. The actual shroud itself has pollen on it from the 1st century, it appears, in Palestine. And it has some other features that appear to be authentic. To this day, they don't know how the image of Jesus or the crucified victim is on this particular piece of cloth. They can't figure out how it could have been put on there. It's not painted on there. There's blood on it. It's a very, very unique find.
Yeah.
I typically don't use that as an argument for the authenticity of Jesus, because there are better arguments, but it is very interesting. In fact, one of the things that Gary thought was interesting is that if you were to put a nail through the wrist, which is really probably where Jesus was crucified, you would break some sort of nerve or bone or tendon or something, which would cause the thumb to collapse. And if you look at the Shroud of Turin, his thumbs are not out, they're in. And that's just one piece of evidence that this appears to be a real crucified victim, and probably is the shroud that covered Christ.
There's when I go to Israel, we go to Caesarea Maritime, and there at the Hippodrome they found the Pilate stone.
Yes,
and which is a lot of scholars did not feel that Pontius Pilate actually was a procurator, and it's funny because where they would do the races with the horses and chariots and all of those things, somebody had taken the stone of Pontius Pilate being the procurator and had put it as a seat in the Hippodrome. So they basically were putting their rear end on that stone because they hated this guy so much. And as they were digging through there, they lifted up and found a stone that said Pontius Pilate was the procurator, which once again, for many years, people didn't think Pontius Pilate was really the procurator, and he actually was.
One archaeological discovery they've never found, and that is the body of Jesus.
That's right.
Okay? And that, by the way, would end Christianity. If you could somehow figure out that was the body of Jesus, right, Christianity would be over, as Paul said. Your faith is in vain if Christ has not risen from the dead. Although they did do some testing recently, Pastor Chip, as you know, at the Church of Holy Sepulchre, and because they have renovated that area, they went in and they did discover that in their carbon dating that the tomb, I think underneath where they had to renovate, was from the 3rd century, which is when the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built. So this is a very ancient tradition that says that that's where his burial spot was. But of course, in fact, we were just talking earlier backstage about who would want to disprove Christianity, and how could they have done it, Pastor Chip?
They would have drugged the body off of the streets.
Yeah.
That's everybody had a reason to fight. They would have found that body and they would have drug it to the streets. Mm-hmm. And there was no body. So the greatest archaeological evidence is that there's no body.
That's right.
So let's continue on here. We got a ton of questions. Questions are coming in like crazy. Goodness gracious. Okay. If God planned to sacrifice his son for our sins, was Judas compelled to betray him?
Compelled, no, because knowledge does not imply causality. This is one of the things that I think can be confusing when we think about what is known as predestination and free will. Since God is outside of time, he knows the end from the beginning. He knows what's going to happen before we do it, but that does not mean we're compelled to do it. If we were to do otherwise, he would have known that too. So knowledge does not imply causality. Every new mother that puts her child down for the night, when the baby's first born, that mother knows that at some point that baby's going to wake up during the night, right? But because the mother knows the baby's going to wake up during the night, does that mean the mother is causing the baby to wake up during the night? No, knowledge does not imply causation. I mean, it might mean causation, but not always. Just because God knows what we're going to do doesn't mean he's causing it. Doesn't mean we don't have free will. Now, you could say, yes, God causes it when he creates the universe because he knows how it's going to turn out. Now, that's true. But we're still freely doing what we're doing. We're still free. Judas freely betrayed Christ. You're freely either accepting or rejecting Christ, even though God knows what you're going to do. And this is why I think this is the solution to the predestination free will problem. Yes, we are predestined, but we're also free. In fact, my co-author, Dr. Norman Geisler, wrote the book, Chosen But Free. You're chosen because it's unavoidable. When God chose to create, he knew how it would turn out. So he's elected the outcome. But that doesn't mean you don't have free will. You still have free will to do what you're going to do. Billy Graham freely chose to accept Christ. Richard Dawkins freely chose not to. And God always knew what they would do. So they are predestined, but they're all also free.
Okay, so let's, man, they just keep piling in. More a scenario, this is from Jeremy, more a scenario than a question. But let's say you have a friend whose 15-year-old son died in an accident, and she, as a non-Christian, comes to you for comfort. You take the opportunity to tell her about Jesus, and in that process, you learn that she and her deceased son are not saved. She then asks you, why should I want to worship a God that allows my son to burn in hell for eternity? How could I enjoy your concept of heaven knowing people I love are eternally damned or destroyed and I'll never see them again?
Right. First of all, if that has just happened, this is not a time for philosophizing or going into what you might think are rational explanations. In fact, a friend of mine lost his son to suicide, and he said people would, well, you know who he is, it's Rick Warren, right? Rick Warren lost his son to suicide, and he said people would call him up or come over to his house and say the most insensitive things because they didn't know what to say. And all he said was, all I wanted was your presence. I don't need an explanation. I don't need rationalizations. I don't need speculations. I just wanted your presence. Your presence was enough. And of course, if you read through the book of Job, you have Job's friends trying to explain everything, and God rebukes them in the end. So when emotions have subsided a little bit, then maybe it's time to talk about issues like this. First of all, we don't know in the end whether somebody at the last second, accepted Christ. But we do know that God is not going to force anybody into heaven against their will. In fact, if you give me a minute, I'll explain how this worked. I was in a debate at the University of Michigan a number of years ago, and the atheist who asked me this question, his name is Eddie Tabash, he's a Beverly Hills attorney, and he said, Frank, my mother was a survivor of the Holocaust. She lived a life full of pain and suffering. Toward the end of her life, somebody offered her the gospel, but she rejected it, and then she died. Is she in hell right now? Well, that's a pretty tough question in front of a secular audience. So I said, Eddie, I don't know where your mother is now. I don't know if she had a deathbed conversion or not. But if she didn't, then God is too loving to force her into heaven against her will. You see, because the assumption behind the question is that everybody wants to go to heaven. That's not true. Who's in heaven? Jesus is in heaven. There have been people running from Jesus their entire lives. What's he going to do in the afterlife? Well, hey, where are you going? You're with me now. That wouldn't be fair. You say, well, what's all this business about hell then? Well, I used an illustration with the University of Michigan audience, and I asked the ladies this question. So ladies, I'm going to ask you the same question in here. Ladies, have you ever had a man pursue you whom you did not want to date? Some of you going, yeah, and he's sitting next to me right now. He will not leave me alone. Now, whenever I ask that question, the ladies always giggle and the men look at their shoes. Like, is she looking at me right now? So anyway, ladies, suppose this man continues to ask you out. He keeps pursuing you, and he keeps asking you out, and you finally say, now look, I like you, but only as a... Ladies, why don't you just stick the knife in and turn it? Every man has heard the dreaded friend rejection. Gentlemen, if you ever get the dreaded friend rejection, I have some advice for you. Move on, she's not interested. In fact, I have some shocking news for you. She doesn't even like you as a friend. Because if she did, she'd be interested, but she's not. Am I right, ladies? I mean, you're just being nice, right? Well, suppose this doesn't deter the guy. He keeps pursuing, he keeps asking you out, and he finally says, look, I love you so much, I'm going to force you to love me. Ladies, run, screaming from the building. Can he force you to love him? No. If he truly did love you, what would he do? He would leave you alone. That's what God does for us. He sends us cards, letters, and flowers. He sends us creation. He sends us conscience. He sends us the Bible. He obviously sends us Christ. He sends us Pastor Chip. He sends us a missionary. He may send us a TV or radio broadcast. If you're in a foreign country, like a Muslim country right now, he may send you a dream or a vision, because there's many reports of Muslims being converted through dreams and visions of Jesus appearing to them. But if he does all that, and you keep saying, no, 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 I don't want you, then God will give you up to your own desire. Paul talks about this in Romans 1, right? He says that he'll give you up to your own desire, to go your own way, because that's what a loving God does. You can't have love without free will. You have to freely love. And if people don't want to love God, what he's going to do is pull himself away, because that's what a loving being does. You say, well, what's all this business about hell then? Well, notice that there are people today, whether they're Christians or not, that experience the common grace of God. They experience nature, beauty, love, relationships, hope for a future. We all experience this, whether we're Christians or not. But I want you to imagine a place where there is no beauty, where there is no love, where there are no relationships, where there is no hope, where there is no future. There's just stone cold, narcissistic self-absorption. That is Washington. No, I'm sorry. That is hell. You're separated from the ultimate source of goodness by your own choice, because there is no choice for God. If you don't want him, he's not going to force himself on you. He's going to leave you alone. And hell is separation from God. Hell is a place of justice. Heaven is a place of grace. And if you don't want grace, God's not going to force you there. Now, if you are in heaven and you know of people who are in hell by their own free choice, you are going to know that that's just. You are going to know that they don't want to be in heaven with Jesus. And as C.S. Lewis famously put it, hell cannot veto heaven. Hell cannot veto heaven. People are going to get justice. They're actually going to get justice in heaven too, because you're going to be rewarded for your good works. You're going to be there on account of grace, but you'll be rewarded for your good works. Or some rewards may be taken away for some of the evil you may have done. But your admittance into heaven is based on grace, and your place in heaven is based on the works you have done. By the way, the same thing is true in hell. There are degrees of punishment in hell, just like there are degrees of reward in heaven. Jesus implies this when he talks about Luke chapter 12, or in Luke chapter 12, about people who knew what the master wanted him to do and disobeyed anyway, and people who didn't have as much knowledge, they were beaten with fewer blows, as Jesus said. Look, God is a God of infinite justice. He's also a God of infinite love. He can't allow injustice or injustice to go unpunished. So what does he do? He punishes himself in our place. That's what the gospel's all about. We should all be in hell without his free sacrifice, without his sacrifice for us, because he's an infinitely just being. But even God can't force free creatures to love him, because because love has to be freely given. So what's God supposed to do? I mean, C.S. Lewis, I think, put it best at the end of, or in this may even be in Screw Tape Letters, now that I think about it, or maybe The Great Divorce, where he says, in the end, there's only two kinds of people. Those who say to God, thy will be done, or those to whom God says, thy will be done. So hell basically means God is just and loving and man is free. Now, emotionally, that may not resonate, especially after someone has gone through a tragedy. But logically, it makes perfect sense.
Is the earth around 8,000 years old? Is micro and macro evolution biblically compatible?
I'm absolutely certain that the universe is at least 59 years old. Okay, it's actually at least 83 because I saw my mom today down in Fort Myers, so it's at least 83, okay? As you know, Christians disagree over this, and we can spend a lot of time talking about different views of this, but I can guarantee you one thing, that when you get to heaven, God isn't going to say, did you think it was old or young? Right? It is not a test for orthodoxy as to whether or not you think the universe is old or young. Now, I personally think that Genesis 1 was written by Moses as a polemic against the Egyptian creation stories. Because when people are coming out of Egypt, they're coming across the desert. They're not walking around going, I wonder how old this place is, right? That's not what they're wondering. They're not wondering about evolution. Or what they're wondering is Yahweh the true God, or are the gods that we just came from in Egypt the true gods? And if you look at the Egyptian stories, and Chip, you can speak to this better than I can probably, that the gods in Egypt that supposedly created the universe somehow created themselves or were already in the universe and then ordered it. And Moses comes along and says, no, God is outside this space-time continuum. He creates this space-time continuum and he orders it. So I don't think Genesis 1 is necessarily written to try and tell us how old the universe is. Although some will try and, it's a perfectly legitimate interpretation to say yes, but I don't think it's necessary. And you know, God has written two books. He's written the book called the Bible and the book of nature. And by the way, you can't understand the book called the Bible without the book of nature. I mean, just read the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, what does that imply you already know? First of all, it implies you know language, right? It also implies you know what a beginning is. It implies you have some idea of what God is. It implies you have some idea of what cause and effect is, right? Some idea of what creation is. These are the things you bring to the text and you have to know before you can know anything the Bible says. And as Chip, he's a seminary professor, he knows there's an aspect of theology called prolegomena, which means what you do before you do theology. And it includes these kind of things: philosophy, language, grammar, cause and effect, the reliability of your senses to know how you can ascertain truths about the real world. So to just look at a text and say it must be taken in this one way, particularly Genesis 1, which looks like it's not Hebrew poetry, but it has poetic elements to it, that could be the right way to text it, but not take it, but not necessarily. You want to say anything about the Egyptians or add to that at all?
Well, you know, the Egyptian sun god was their Ra was like the most important.
Yeah.
The sun's created on day 4. It's almost like, oh, the sun, yeah, forget about it. You know, there's polemic there. Yeah, I think that, you know, the question is, you know, if you read the text, does it seem to indicate that there was a day? Yeah, I mean, that's the literal reading of the text. Mm-hmm. The question is the Hebrew word yom, day, what does that mean? Is that a period? Is that, you know, all that stuff? I think that, and then the question becomes, what are we actually reading in Genesis 1? Are we reading a scientific treatise like we think of in the world today? Or are we reading a theological document that's helping the, you know, newly found people that have come out of Egyptian bondage to understand who Yahweh is? And in their world, they did not have the same cosmology that we do. They didn't have the same questions that we do. They believed that matter was eternal. Right. So like even in the creation narrative, which we believe as Christians that the world was created ex nihilo, that means out of nothing. Hebrews 11 says that the things that we see were created of things that weren't seen. But in Genesis 1, the reality is in the text, God comes upon the world. It's already there, and it doesn't have any form. It's void. It needs to be put together. And the word create, bara in Hebrew, can mean to create something that was not here to something that was here, but it can also mean create in me a new heart, O Lord. In other words, arrange it in a way that's right. So you have to ask, is Genesis 1 ontological creation or is it functional creation? And so, a reading of the text, you're going to have people bogged down. Some are going to say it's functional creation. God is ordering the world and he's putting things together so that the world functions properly because it's chaotic. He comes upon it. Others would say, no, this is a scientific thing, a la Ken Ham and those types of people. I think the real thing is that we shouldn't make the reading of Genesis a test for orthodoxy, because Augustine did not believe the world was young. And there's other people that do believe the earth is young. I think the real thing is you have to start asking, what does Genesis say? And I do think Christians can disagree on that. But my personal feeling is that creation is giving us the sense of how God works, not only in the world, but he works in our hearts. Paul in the Corinthian correspondence talks about creation, that the light shone in our hearts. It's the gospel. And the creation story is a wonderful gospel because it's taking something that's chaotic and ordering it to where it's good. And I think that's what God wants to do in all of creation. He wants to take things that are messed up and not right, and he wants to form them in such a way that they are good. And I think that Romans gestures towards that in chapter 8, that the whole creation is waiting to be put back together to good, and God is working all things together for good for those, So I think Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 can be read in many different ways. But I would tend to lean towards reading Genesis 1 and 2 as probably a little bit more some poetics with functional creation rather than just ontological creation. And I think the world's old, but if I get to heaven and God goes, "You dummy, it's 10,000 years old," I don't care. I believed in Jesus. That's what's important. But some people will say, if you don't take it that way, then you don't believe the Bible. And if you don't believe the Bible, I just would say that the Philippian jailer, when he said, "What do I got to do to be saved?" Paul didn't say you got to believe the Bible. They didn't even have one. He said, "Believe in Jesus, and you'll be saved."
Let me mention one other thing, Chip, on this, because about that. I mentioned the two books that God has written, the book of nature and the book called the Bible, through other people, obviously. Sometimes you side with the book of nature to tell you what the book of Bible, what the book called the Bible means. In fact, for example, sunrise and sunset, right? The Bible says the sun rises and the sun sets. So how are we to take that? Are we to take it that it's a literal sun that's literally rising and literally setting? Or is this observational language? Well, how do we know it's observational language? Because we know through nature that we're actually going around the sun isn't going around us, and so the Bible is using observational language. Here's an example where you're taking what you know about nature and saying, okay, the Bible's using observational language, it's not literal language. And by the way, we do this today in our scientific age. If you watch the news tonight, the local news, you're going to see the meteorologist going to say, sunrise tomorrow at 6:14. He's not going to say Earth rotation will become apparent at 6:14. Okay? So observational language, that's how we understand the Bible. And you can use things from outside the Bible. In fact, you have to use things from outside the Bible to understand what the Bible says.
Okay. What do you see as the number one challenge against the church in the next 10 years?
The number one challenge of the church in
the number one challenge against the church.
Oh, against the church. Apathy. It's apathy. It's within the church.
Yeah.
Right? We're the problem. In fact, by the way, I know as you look around our nation and even around the world, you see things just appear to be just falling apart morally. And you're going, how can this be? You know whose fault it is? It's our fault. Why? Because 100 years ago, the church went anti-intellectual. What do I mean by that? 100 years ago, the church didn't think like it could answer Darwinism and these kind of philosophies. So instead of engaging the culture, they separated from the culture. They said, don't study philosophy. Don't study these things. Don't get involved in the media. Don't get involved in law. Don't get involved in education. Just believe the Bible. And so they created their own little Bible colleges, their own little seminaries. Nothing wrong with that alone, but they actually retreated from the culture. They separated from the culture. And when you take the godly influence out of something, then whatever you've taken that godly influence out of becomes godless. And so what happened is that since we're no longer in the media and we're no longer in law and we're no longer in education, John Dewey in the 1930s, the humanist, kind of took over American education. And he trained, and his philosophy of humanism trained all the Supreme Court justices that eventually rose to the Supreme Court. And in the early 1960s, they just began throwing any expression of Christianity right out of the public square. And the great cultural issues that have caused so much consternation among Christians, like abortion and same-sex marriage and now sexual orientation, by Justice Gorsuch a couple of years ago, basically putting sexual orientation in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. All that has occurred by the court, not by the people. But why is the court where it is? Because the church extracted itself from the culture and allowed the secularists to take over. In fact, back in 2009, I wrote a column on our website, crossexamine.org, but I could have written it yesterday. The title is "Country a Mess, Blame the Church." We're the problem. And we're now so afraid to even say anything because somebody may cancel us on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. No, we're called to speak the truth and leave the results to God. In fact, if you really want to help people, I love what Thomas Sowell said. I don't know if you know who Thomas Sowell is. Thomas Sowell is a 91-year-old economist who actually grew up in Harlem most of his life and somehow learned to read and then became a professor at Stanford and at University of Chicago and at Cornell. And if you just search for him on YouTube, you'll be binge watching Thomas Sowell clips. And I don't even know if he's a Christian, but he's so bright. He said this: when you tell someone what they want to, or let me start over. When you tell somebody what they need to hear, you're helping them. When you tell somebody what they want to hear, you're helping yourself. Notice, Jesus gave us one command, one new command. He said, here's a new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you. How did he love us? He sacrificed himself for us. So to love others, we should be sacrificing ourselves for others. But when we tell them what they want to hear, we're sacrificing them for us. Because we don't want to put up with the blowback we may get from them. And so we're protecting ourselves when we tell them what they want to hear. We're helping them when we tell them what they need to hear. Look, love does not require approval. Our culture thinks love requires approval. Every parent knows that love doesn't require approval. If you approve of everything your kid wants to do, are you loving? No, you're unloving. Same thing is true in the culture. You want to love people? You need to tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. And most of that revolves around the sexual issues, as you know now, because that's where all the pushback is coming from.
Well, that leads us to the next, you can clap. We clap here at Grace. The good thing about Frank is he will tell you exactly what he thinks. That's what I appreciate about you. You don't candy coat anything.
My wife hates that.
Does she? Pray for her. So this next question goes into this. When discussing the topic of homosexuality with a deconstructing Christian.
Discussing the topic of homosexuality with what?
When discussing the topic of homosexuality with a deconstructing Christian.
Yes.
Deconstructing Christians are Christians that are on their way out of Christianity. Mm-hmm. They're talking themselves out of Christianity. Mm-hmm. Their arguments, people who are deconstructing, their arguments for affirming homosexuality is that the actual word was not put in the Bible until 1946, or that the meaning of unnatural relations is only referring to pedophilia. How do you combat this argument with biblical truth that won't be taken as bigotry?
As it won't be taken as bigotry. Well, when someone calls you a bigot, you don't want to say, I'm not a bigot. You want to say, what do you mean by bigotry? What does that mean? I had a homosexual activist once call me that. And I said, well, what do you mean by bigotry? And he said, fear and intolerance. And I said, that's not the definition of bigotry. Definition of bigotry is having a firm opinion on something that you haven't researched. You have a prejudiced view. And I said, with all due respect, if anyone is a bigot in this conversation, it must be you, because I've written an entire book on this topic and you haven't read it yet. You don't even know why I believe what I believe. So the book I had written was called Correct, Not Politically Correct, How Same-Sex Marriage Hurts Everyone. So you can't predict necessarily how someone, or let me say it differently, you can't control how someone is going to take what you're going to say. You should try and strive to be 100% truth and 100% grace all at the same time. Now, the only person I know who does this successfully is Jesus, right? But we have to be 100% truth and 100% grace at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, think of the life of Jesus. Can you remember, or even the apostles, can you remember one time, let's just think Jesus for a second. Can you remember any time where Jesus told someone what they wanted to hear? I can think of one time where an apostle did that. In fact, Chip, we were talking about it backstage. The apostle was Peter, and he was trying to appease the Judaizers who wanted him to continue to obey the Old Testament laws. And what did Paul do? Paul said, I told him to his face that he was wrong. Paul had to dope slap Peter in the Bible, okay, because he's a fallen human being like the rest of us. But Jesus told people what they needed to hear. So the question about the word homosexuality, it appears, what, they said 1945 or something? Whether the word is a new word or not, that's not the issue. The act is what is at play here. And in Romans chapter 1, Paul describes the act. He doesn't use the word homosexuality. He uses unnatural acts. And the unnatural acts were not pedophilia. The unnatural acts were the acts of homosexual sex. And he uses men with men and women with women. And the same thing happens in Leviticus 18, as you know. But Leviticus is an Old Testament document, and it deals with the Old Covenant. We're in the New Covenant, but some of the principles in the Old Covenant are universal. They come into the New Covenant. This is one of them. And so when someone says that they think homosexuality is affirmed by Jesus, instead of going through a long dissertation as to why you think that's not the case, you might want to ask them, well, why do you think that's true? What evidence do you have for that position? And if the evidence is, well, the word wasn't used until 1945, but the act is still described, that is really what the word means, the argument doesn't work. Doesn't matter if you use the word or not, the act is described. And why is the act described? Well, you don't really even need the Bible to know that same-sex relationships are not according to the natural design. This is called natural law. Men and women are compatible. They're made for one another to procreate and bring forth the next generation. Two men and two women are not meant for one another. Not if part of the goal, of course, is to procreate and to bring forth the next generation. And natural law says that that's what at least the primary use of the sex is, to procreate and bring forth the next generation. You can't do that when you have two men or two women. You want to add anything to that?
Well, I think that what I would add, and where you do apologetics and you answer questions when it comes to the church, I would say I don't think the church has done a very good job of listening and caring for the homosexual groups. I think we could have done a much better job over the years than what we've done. And I think we've almost put them into like a category of their own, where it's like they're the worst, and we're, and I think that we've got to rediscover how we can minister to that community. But I do think the two questions are completely separate. Does the Bible affirm it, and how do we also address and how do we deal with that type of ministry? I think those are two different questions. I would just say that anybody who thinks that the word homosexuality was invented in 1946 does not understand any history at all. Plato's Symposium, that was written hundreds of years before Jesus ever came about, was all about homosexual relationships. I mean, there's no question. I mean, this is not something that's new. And I don't think, I say, because I have a lot of friends that are gay, and I have some people in my family that are that have same-sex attraction, and I have some close friends that are that way. And one of the things that I, try to always say to them is that, look, I'm going to love you and I care about you, but the reality is that in Romans 1, it's just the evidence is overwhelmingly clear that people who are walking away from God are one of the things that is the categories of that is men on men and women on women. And I understand that's a tough sell in today's culture. I understand when you say those things, it offends people, it gets people up in arms, and we want to be able to say things in love, not just in truth too. But I think that to say that is something that was invented in 1946, that's not true. There is a lot of data that there was pedophilia in the first century, but there's no good evidence in Koine Greek that what we're reading in Romans 1 or even we're reading in the pastoral epistles as well, that those are somehow men on men in terms of like men on boys. I'm sure it does take into effect some of those things, but the idea is unnatural sexual relationships. And I think that you have to go all the way back to creation. God created a man and a woman for that intimate relationship in marriage, and that's just the way God created it. And we have a fundamental issue here when we say Jesus is Lord. We have to make a decision. Do I follow what Jesus wants me to do, or do I want to do my own thing? There's plenty of things in my life, in Chip Bennett's life, that if I just wanted to go do what I wanted to do, would not match up with the Bible. And I could say, but this is the way I feel. This is what's within me. This is whatever. But at the end of the day, I've decided that Jesus is Lord, and that means that he gets to decide what the rules are, not Chip Bennett. And that's tough. And it's tough for me. It's probably tough for you at times to say Jesus, your Lord. But I think that those are the things that we've got to struggle through. But from a pastoral standpoint, I'm always looking at how can we reach the gay community? How can we reach the lesbian community in a way where they feel like that they know that they have value and dignity and worth, and they come in here and sit on the front row, and we will be glad to have anybody here because that's the gospel. But then trying to also teach and to talk through those issues become very complicated because you get pushed away.
Sure.
Because you're intolerant, you're whatever, and I'm like the most tolerant person in the world. I mean, I'll sit down with anybody and have a conversation, but it's tough because these are issues that are so emotional right now.
I don't know if it was you, Chip, or another pastor told me this, that some folks from the gay community came to the church, and afterwards they came up to the pastor and said, "Are you gay affirming?" Which of course means, do you agree with same-sex behavior? Now, is evil an argument against God? At least 3 people say no. Actually, no, evil is actually an argument for God. Why? Because objective evil presupposes objective good, and objective good requires God. You say, what do you mean? Because evil does not exist on its own. Evil only exists as a lack in a good thing. Evil is like cancer. If you take all the cancer out of a good body, you got a better body. What happens if you take all the body out of the cancer? It doesn't exist. Can't exist. Evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of a car, you got a better car. What happens if you try and take all the car out of the rust? Doesn't exist. Evil can only exist as a parasite in a good thing. A totally moth-eaten garment is a hanger. It doesn't exist. So while evil is real, it can only exist in a good thing. And if it can only exist in a good thing, then goodness exists as the essential part of reality. And any deviation from goodness would be what we would call evil. Now, this was not lost on C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was an atheist early on in his life because he went through World War I, the terrible war. And for a while, he thought there can't be a good God because there's too much injustice in the world. And then one day he had an epiphany, and he wrote it in the book Mere Christianity. How many people in here have read Mere Christianity? Okay, if you haven't read Mere Christianity, consider yourself undereducated. You need to read Mere Christianity. And here's what Lewis said about that in the book Mere Christianity. Basically, that evil requires good and good requires God. Here's how he put it. He said, and as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how would I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You see, there can't be a crooked line unless you know what a straight line is. You wouldn't know what injustice was unless you knew what justice was. Something can't be immoral unless something is. Something can't be not right unless something is. And that presupposes God. Otherwise, everything's just a matter of opinion. So, evil does not disprove God. It may show there's a devil out there, but it can't disprove God. You could look at it this way as well. The shadows prove the sunshine. In order to have shadows, you have to have sunshine. In other words, in order to have evil, you have to have good. Oh, you can have sunshine without shadows. You can have good without evil, but you can't have shadows without sunshine. You can't have evil without good. If evil exists, and everybody knows it does, then God must exist. Because if there is no God, that means there is no good, which means there is no evil. And even Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist I quoted a minute ago, actually agrees that if there's no God, there's no right or wrong. There's no good or bad. There's no just or unjust. In fact, here's his famous quote on this. He says, if atheistic materialism is true, in other words, if we're just all moist robots, there is no spiritual realm. Everything that happens just happens through the laws of physics. Here's what he says. He says, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get lucky and other people are going to get, or some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason, nor any justice. There is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. If he's right, you're just like a Coke can fizzing. You're not really a sentient being, you're just a molecular machine. And there's no good, there's no bad, there's no justice, there's no right, there's no wrong. Now wait a minute, you might be thinking, wait, isn't this the same guy that just said this? Notice right in the middle of this quote, he called God unjust. He just got done telling us there is no justice. Wait a minute, you can't have it both ways. Where's he getting this concept of injustice from? He's stealing it from God. He has to sit in God's lap to slap his face. On one hand, he's saying there's no justice. On the other hand, he's saying the God of the Bible's unjust. You can't have it both ways. You know there's justice and injustice, so God must exist. So to sum this up, the existence of evil doesn't indicate the absence of God from the world, but the absence of him from our lives. We're the ones that brought evil into this world. And now we're paying the price. So let's go back to our two-column chart right here. Evil should actually not be on the right side. We need to move evil over to the other side. Because evil is actually an argument for God, not an argument against God. But we're still left with the question, okay, it doesn't disprove God, but what's the purpose of evil then? God hasn't ended it. Why does he allow it to continue? But probably about 15 years ago, I was at Michigan State University. We go to colleges and we do I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist presentations. And I was going through the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist presentation at Michigan State, and there was a militant atheist in the audience. And I knew he was a militant atheist in the audience because he sat through the entire 2-hour presentation looking like this. I mean, he didn't crack a smile once. And I had some pretty good jokes in there. Anyway, as soon as I was done speaking, I said, are there any questions? And his hand shot up over here, and I said, yes, sir. And he said, if there is a good God, why doesn't he stop all the evil in the world? I said, sir, that is an excellent question. Maybe because if he did, he might start with you and me, because we do evil every day. Do you ever notice when we complain about evil, we're always complaining about somebody else? Hey, God, why don't you stop him? Hey, God, why don't you stop her? We never say, God, why don't you stop me? Because if God wanted to stop evil, he might just start with me. He might just start with you. In fact, if God were to stop evil tonight at midnight, would you still be alive at 12:01? I wouldn't be. So I said, actually, sir, that is a really good question, and we could take semesters to talk about it, but we don't have semesters. So I have a way of showing you a lot in a short period of time via this 1 minute and 46-second video. It's not going to answer the problem completely, but it'll give you a good doorway to an answer. So I showed him this video. And I'm going to show it to you right now, okay? Same video I showed at Michigan State. It's 1 minute and 46 seconds. You got to pay attention. A lot going on. You ready? Here we go.
Is God good? If he is, why is there suffering and evil? Let's assume for the moment that God is all-powerful. This means that God can do anything that is logically possible. So he can create galaxies and subatomic particles and rainforests and you. But God cannot do what is logically impossible. He cannot make a square circle or a one-ended stick. So can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? No. So what if, when God created human beings, he wanted them to be free? Freedom's a good thing. But if humans are to be free, they cannot be forced to obey God. Because freedom without choice is like a square circle. It's a logical contradiction. No choice, no freedom. God didn't want robots. He wanted real people. The first humans endowed with the awesome power of free choice abused their freedom. The tragic consequences of their bad choice and our bad choices ripple across the world. God is responsible for the fact of freedom, but humans are responsible for their acts of freedom. But let's remember, we don't suffer alone. God will put an end to suffering and evil. And God became a man to suffer with us. God is good, and he wants real people like you to know him, but the free choice is yours.
Crossexamine.org. You can see some, also our YouTube channel, 2 words, Cross-Examine. That particular video was put together by a friend of mine, Jim Zangmeister, who went to our seminary in Charlotte, Southern Evangelical Seminary. And he's made a number of those. If you type in "Is God Good" in YouTube, you'll find that. And there's a bunch of other ones that he's done for Dr. William Lane Craig. You can find them on his website. Anyway, the main point of that video, as you saw, is that evil exists because we have free will, which is the only way that love could exist. So God gives us free will so we could love, but it also opens up the possibility for evil. And we do evil, we sin. Now, after I showed that video, how do you think the atheist looked? He looked like this. He said, okay, I can see how free will has something to do with it, but that can't explain everything. What about babies? Why do babies die? They didn't do anything wrong. There's no free will there. I said, sir, in order for us to figure out why a particular thing happened in life, we have to know what the purpose of life is. Because you can't know the purpose of a particular thing in life unless you know what the overall purpose of life is. So since I had just gone through the evidence that Christianity was true, that the Bible was true, I asked the audience, what's the purpose of life? So what is the purpose of life? This is the interactive portion of the program. What is the purpose of life? I hear people say, glorify God. Where's that in the Bible? That's the Westminster Confession. I mean, it's true. I'm just saying, where would you go scripturally to point that out? I think one of the clearest ways of pointing out what the purpose of life is what Jesus prayed in his high priestly prayer in John 17 when he's praying about us, the believers. And here's what he says as he's praying to the Father. This is eternal life, that they, meaning us, may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you've sent. The purpose of life is to know God and to make him known. Now, not just intellectually, right? James, the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote that little book in the New Testament called, you guys are sharp this morning. He says even the demons know that God exists, but they tremble. Do you realize the demons know that God exists better than we do? But they don't trust in him. They just know it intellectually. They don't repent. They can't. They're fixed, but we can repent. We can know God in a relational way, and then we can make him known. The second half of this, of course, is the Great Commission. Matthew 28:19. Go therefore make disciples of all nations. Notice he didn't say make believers. Make disciples. So the purpose of life is to know God, grow in God, and make God known. Here's the problem. Knowing and growing in God often requires pain. C.S. Lewis put it so well. He said that God whispers to us in our pleasure, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to arouse a deaf world. Sometimes you only look up when you're on your back. You're not interested in God until something goes wrong. And then suddenly you go, oh, maybe I don't have it all together. This is why Jesus said it's difficult for a rich man to get into heaven. Why did he say that? Because when you're rich, you think you can control everything. And then as soon as you realize you can't, then suddenly maybe God becomes more real to you. Now, thankfully, he didn't say it was impossible for a rich man to get into heaven, because if that were the case, none of us would make it. According to America, according to the world, we're all rich here in America. And of course, the scriptures talk about the value of pain and suffering. James says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Question, ladies and gentlemen, how many people count it all joy when you get into various trials? Crickets, right? I want to get out of it, don't you? He says you got to do this because your testing of your faith produces patience. You become more like Jesus when you go through this. Paul in Romans 5 says, we also glory in tribulation. How many people in here glory in tribulation? Can I see your hands, please? You're a liar if your hand's up. None of us do. But that's what Paul says, glory in tribulation. Knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. We need difficulty in our lives. We need people to say no. We need trouble. We need obstacles. If not, how do we become? In fact, let me ask you this. What would happen to you if you got everything you wanted every time? I know. I would become even more of a moral monster than I already am if I got everything I wanted all the time. I mean, what do we call kids who get everything they want? Spoiled. What makes them spoiled? What's spoiled? Their character's spoiled. If you want to ruin a kid, just give him everything he wants. You will ruin them. You need difficulty. You need people to say no. You need trouble to come in your life. If you don't, you're not going to become more like Jesus. You're going to become more like a demon. Like a self-entitled celebrity who, if he doesn't get his water at 41.6 degrees, he's pitching a hissy fit. And in fact, if you think about this, some virtues can only be developed through evil and trial. It's really hard to develop courage unless there's danger. It's hard to develop perseverance without obstacles. Hard to develop compassion unless someone is suffering. It's really hard to get patience without tribulation. Now, I'm a very impatient person, and I've been praying for patience for quite a while, and frankly, I'm getting tired of waiting for it. By the way, never pray for patience. What's going to happen if you do? Everything will go wrong all week. No character without adversity. And no faith, meaning trust, without need. If you think you've got it all squared away and you don't need anybody, you're not going to trust in God. You're going to think that you're going to do it your own way. You know, the problem with the self-made man is that he worships his creator. That's the problem. We need difficulty. We need trouble. And I know this is going to sound trite, but it's true. No pain, no gain. Actually, that doesn't go far enough. The real truth is more pain, more gain. And this is what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4. He's wrapping up a little section on suffering, and here's how he wraps it up. He says, for our light and momentary troubles here on this earth are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. In other words, the difficulty you go through here enhances your capacity not only to enjoy God now, but also in eternity. Now, it's hard to communicate this in an analogy, but I'll give you kind of a trite analogy since most of us understand sports in here. I'll give you a sports analogy that I think this is communicating. I grew up in New Jersey. Forget about it. So I grew up as a New York Giant fan. And in 2004, the New York Giants traded with the San Diego Chargers to get Eli Manning, #1 in the draft. And the first few years in New York, he wasn't very good. And in fact, when your name is Manning, your brother is Peyton, you're selected #1, and you're not very good, and you're playing in New York, you're going to hear it, right? So he took a lot of grief his first few years. And then in 2007, he had a pretty good year. He got his team to the playoffs. And then he wound up beating 3 favored teams on the road to get to the Super Bowl. One of those favored teams he beat on the road was the hated Dallas Cowboys. In fact, we have a saying in New Jersey. It goes like this. Whenever the Cowboys win, it's living proof that Satan is alive and well. The problem was Eli and the Giants were going up against the 18-0 New England Patriots, who already had a book 19-0 written. All they had to do was put the final score on the last page. They were going to be the greatest team of all time. They were favored by 12 points. The only people that picked the Giants were the Giants. In fact, before the game, in the media day, they went up to Plexico Burress, who was a receiver for the Giants, and said, Plexico, what's going to be the final score? And Plexico said, we're going to win 21-17. And then the media guy went over to Tom Brady and said, Plexico said the Giants are going to win 21-17. And all Brady said was, oh, we're only going to score 17 points? Okay, because they had set records that year for scoring points. So he thought that was a ridiculous prediction. Anyway, then they actually played the game. Giants had a really good defense. They sacked Brady 5 times, which he didn't like. Turns out it's a pitcher's duel. 2 minutes to go, Patriots ahead 14-10. Eli has to take his team 80 yards to win. He's about to go down under a sure sack because he's normally a statue back there. But somehow he spins out of the sack. He throws a Hail Mary pass over the middle of the field, and it's caught by a guy by the name of David Tyree, who pins it up against his helmet. And if you remember this play, some of you are old enough to remember this. And he walked off the field. They have all this on video. This guy happened to be a Christian. He walked off the field, and he said, hey, man, this is supernatural. And then he didn't catch another pass the rest of his NFL career. Okay? A couple of plays later, Manning hits Burress, the guy who predicted the score, in the end zone with 35 seconds to go. The Giants win 17-14. The Patriots don't even score 17 points, and Tom Brady was deflated. Some of you will get that tomorrow. And then Eli and the Giants beat the Patriots 4 years later again. Now, what's the point of all this? After the Super Bowl, Eli held up the Lombardi Trophy, and so did the third-string quarterback who hardly played it down all year. But question, did Eli enjoy the celebration more? Of course he did. Why? Because he'd been in the game the whole time, the whole season, the whole career. He was told he couldn't do it. He played through injuries. He played through difficulty. He played through people who said he could never win the big game. So by going through all the difficulty, he actually enhanced his capacity to enjoy the reward when it came. The third-string quarterback who hadn't been in the game, or any of the games most of the year, he was happy to be there, but he didn't enhance his capacity enough to really enjoy it as much as Eli. That's what goes on here. When you go through difficulty, you're enhancing your soul. You're growing your soul. When you get everything you want, you're shrinking it. And this is what I think Paul is saying, that our light and momentary afflictions are achieving for us a greater glory that far outweighs them all. And when you go through difficulty, it will lead to a greater good. In fact, this is what the scriptures say, that suffering will bring a greater good. Paul actually says this in Romans 8. He says, and we know that all things work together for good to those that love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Notice how he doesn't say all things are good. No, there's a lot of evil out there. He's saying that all things work together for good. So when somebody says, why do babies die? Well, I can say, I don't know. I know why babies die in general, because we live in a fallen world. I mean, imagine this. Imagine if you were indestructible till age 70. Imagine if that were the case. I don't know about you, but I think we'd be incredibly reckless until 69 years and 11 months, right? And then we go, I guess we got to get serious about this thing, right? No, we live in a fallen world. I know why there's evil, and I know why people die now. But if you're going to ask me why does a particular baby die, I don't know why that particular baby dies. But I know why I don't know why. Because I'm finite, I'm inside of time, and God is outside of time. He can see the end from the beginning. He can see how it can all work together. Now, after I explained all this at Michigan State, how do you think the atheist looked? He looked like this. He said, that doesn't explain it all. Okay, I can see how some evil can lead to good. But there's some evil out there that has absolutely no good that results from it. It's what philosophers call gratuitous evil. There's no good that can ever come from it. So I said, sir, how could you know that? You'd have to be God to know that. Now, it is true. If life just ends at the tomb, yeah, there's a lot of evil that probably has no ultimate good to it. There's no justice, right? There are many people that go to the grave who have committed crimes that have never been punished. Many rights are not wronged. There are many goods that never arrive, because if life ends at the grave, there's no resolution. But what if life doesn't end at the grave? What if it goes beyond the grave? Then what? This is what Paul's saying. We need to have an eternal perspective. I've been struggling with evil, the question of evil, for a long time, until I discovered one thing called the ripple effect. What's the ripple effect? That everything that happens today ripples forward into the future to affect billions, if not trillions, of other events. In fact, think of the ripple effect in your own life. I mean, let's just think about your parents. Your parents had to meet for you to be here. And then their parents had to meet for them to be here and you to be here. And then their parents had to meet. Think about all the ripples that went into you sitting here right now. Some of those ripples were good. Some of those ripples were bad. But God can bring good from evil even when we can't see it. Why does a particular baby die now? I don't know, but I know why I don't know why. Maybe a particular baby dying now ripples forward into the future to somehow create 500 years from now a great evangelist who saves millions of people. That baby dying contributed to that great evangelist. I can't see that. I'm inside of time, but God can see the end from the beginning. This is why he can bring good from evil even when we can't see it. This is the ripple effect. Now, the Bible talks about the ripple effect, but not in these words. In fact, you remember Joseph from the Old Testament? Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers who don't like him because he's dad's favorite. And then he winds up in Egypt, and he's falsely accused in Egypt, but then somehow he works his way into prominence in Egypt, and he puts a lot of grain aside. And then his family, many years later, leave Israel to escape a famine. They come to Egypt to escape the famine, and as soon as Joseph sees them, as soon as he recognizes them, these are the people, his family, that sold him into slavery, what does he say? You dirty rats, you're going to pay for what you did to me. No, he doesn't say that. What does he say? Here's what he says. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. He could actually see the ripple effect. The very people that did evil to Joseph, that evil rippled forward to help them later. Now, of course, we don't do evil so that evil or good will result, but sometimes God shows that to us. Showed it to us in this passage right here. So the bottom line to the whole thing is that while respecting free choice, God can bring good from evil, even when we can't see it. Now, when people often bring up this problem of God and evil, they normally say this, that God is all loving and all powerful. If he's all loving and all powerful, why does evil still exist? What they say is, he's either not all loving, or he's not all powerful, or he's neither, because evil still exists. But you know what people are forgetting when they try and say this? Yeah, God is all loving. Yeah, God is all powerful. They also forget that God is all wise, that God is all knowing. He can see the end from the beginning. He can see how all the ripples come together. One of the most profound things ever said on this topic was said by a Roman Catholic priest about 150 years ago at Notre Dame in France, in Paris. And here's what he said about this issue. He said, if God would concede me his power for 24 hours, you would see how many changes I would make in the world. But if he gave me his wisdom too,